Recognise there is no, I think, inherent contradiction in being a very pro-growth, supply-side liberalising social democratic party. It's very hard to see the current government ditching or even significantly watering down net zero.
It was also sold to the public as essentially cost-free net zero.
When Nick Clegg was nixing the idea of any new nuclear, saying, well, what's the point in new nuclear? It wouldn't come online for 10 years. Well, 10 years would have put it right about when Russia invaded Ukraine and global gas prices shot through the roof.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director, and Tom Clougherty, our Executive Director. This is the podcast that tries to get under the bonnet of the week's headlines and into the policy issues that matter to classical liberals like us here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. This week there's been plenty to get our teeth into, not least a new US president, and growth plans abound from our government here in the United Kingdom. Tom, to kick us off, talk us through the latest development in the government's, in Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's plan for growth. Do they have one? What is it? Are they being forced in one direction rather than another?
Well, they're certainly making the right noises, or so it seems. So Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, has been interviewed by The Economist magazine in Davos this week, which is, I think, a sign that they're courting the populist vote. And basically, I think the Economist interview is quite interesting because they say, that the emphasis of her economic discussion has shifted massively from pre-election, where so much of it was about this kind of big government, entrepreneurial state, Bidenomics, securonomics, whatever you want to call it. And now she is just talking a lot about deregulation. And it is mostly just talk at this point, but very clearly the emphasis, I think, has shifted. They're right to identify that. And probably it's shifted because they realize they don't have the money for all of the other stuff, given the fiscal situation they find themselves in. And I apologize just for referring to my notes for a second, but I think some of these direct quotes that they have from Rachel Reeves in The Economist this week are quite instructive. So she identifies, quote, a long-standing supply-side issue, too many things holding back investment, suggests the government needs, quote, an active supply-side approach to improve the productive capacity of our economy. Now, that is something that one could very easily say on an Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with a straight face. So, as I say, they are making the right noises. And she also, in that interview, she talks up what the government is going to do on reforming the planning system. She talks up what they're doing on regulation more generally. There, I think it does feel a little bit weak because the only story we've really had is that she summoned in the heads of the economic regulators to ask them for their ideas. And also, she's talked up what the government is doing on capital markets, which again, I'm not sure there's really that much there for them to boast about in terms of genuine supply-side liberalisation. But what I think is maybe the most interesting thing to discuss here is this idea of whether a government that probably had no real intention of radical supply-side liberalisation, and indeed many of the interest groups that surround them, and indeed their whole political ideology and their personal baggage kind of mitigates against doing supply-side liberalisation. Can they nevertheless be forced into it by circumstance, and can they make a success of it? Because I think there was this idea with the government, and we've talked about it before, that simply by being more competent and more responsible, as they saw it, basically by not being the Conservatives, it would boost confidence and businesses would start investing again and growth would pick up and they'd have lots of money to splash on the public services left, right and centre. Now, that hasn't happened. In a way, they put the cart before the horse, assuming that their personal qualities would just attract investment and growth. They whacked up taxes, they ramped up borrowing. What you've seen is a massive fall in business confidence. You've seen, obviously, Britain, debt is getting more expensive for governments around the world, but Britain is an outlier in how quickly that has gone. And so any fiscal headroom the government might have had seems to have disappeared. Basically, you're in a situation where you have a fresh Labour government that has won a massive majority and still has, 4.5 years ahead of it. And already people are starting to think, can these guys actually do anything at all with their time in power? Because they want to improve public services, but their only idea for how to do that is to spend more money. They can't spend more money because borrowing is expensive and people are already fed up with the tax rises they've done already. Basically, unless they get economic growth, and unless they get economic growth in a way that doesn't require the spending of a lot of government money. Now, us around this table would probably say all the good ways of getting economic growth don't involve spending a lot of government money. In fact, spending a lot of government money is generally counterproductive. That's probably not the way they think about it. That's not their mental model. But could they nevertheless be forced into saying, well, we're desperate for growth, we don't have any money to splash on it, so we're going to have to do what people have talked about for years and which the Conservatives always said we're going to get round to it, but they never did: radical supply-side liberalisation to improve the productive capacity of the economy and get growth going again. Frankly, I don't think they will. And I think we're probably likely to get much more of a miserable muddling through over the rest of this parliament. And I think when you look at what they're doing on energy with net zero, when you look at what the government is doing on employment regulation, it's fairly clear that whatever pro-growth rhetoric is coming from the Treasury on supply-side liberalisation, it hasn't filtered out through Whitehall yet. But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance that things could change. And I defamed the great Roger Douglas on this podcast last week by describing him as Australian. I did correct, well, Kristian corrected me. I'll get it right the first time. New Zealand, late 70s, early 80s, really radical deregulation. And that came from a Labour government that was effectively forced into it by a really nightmarish economic situation. We may not be there yet. Maybe we're still just slowly boiling the frog, but there is historical precedent.
Well, the ideal outcome would probably be that, so to stick with the New Zealand analogy, yes, they were initially forced into it by circumstances, but at least Roger Douglas himself, maybe not his wider party, then started believing it. So this could be the sort of thing where, say, the doctor tells you you're in really bad shape, you need to start doing some exercise, and you do it reluctantly, and then at some point you start actually enjoying it, and it becomes real. And I can't see a contradiction there, but it is a bit of a problem, and The Economist mentioned that as well in a separate article, that Labour are very much late converts to supply-side reforms. And I said this as well when Keir Starmer suddenly, I think it was half a year or a bit more before the election, started to talk about YIMBYism, something that he never mentioned before. And they picked this up as well in The Economist, that this is all very much last minute. They compared him to this popular meme where you have the middle-aged man who tries to come across as a high school kid, walks around with a skateboard and says, "How do you do, fellow kids?" And they said that about Keir Starmer, "How do you do, fellow Schumpeterians?"
Yeah.
It is clearly skin deep. It's not a deep conviction for him or any of the people around him. But what could happen is that they just build up this expectation that they start identifying the supply side constraints as what's really holding back the economy, run out of other options, and just by default, because they have nothing else to do and they might paint themselves into a corner, start maybe going on just for lack of a better alternative. And what's positive about some of these latest announcements is that, okay, it's still lacking a lot of the specifics, but what little we have in terms of specifics sounds quite good. So they want to be tougher on, instances where NIMBYs use lawfare, so disingenuous, bad faith, use of legal processes, starting a lawsuit, starting legal action where they know they cannot win, or they know that it's very unlikely that they win, but they just do it to firstly slow down progress, but also taking legal action is basically just a way of expressing an opinion, rather than writing a Twitter thread saying we are against X, Y, and Z for these reasons. They take legal action, and that is just a way of communicating opposition. If you just limit the opportunities for that kind of lawfare, and ideally make people responsible for the cost, some of the cost that causes, then as far as specific proposals go, that could go a long way to address some of those issues.
Yeah. I think what we're looking at is after the election, Labour won the election by basically not being the Tories, and they had this whole Ming bars strategy through the election, which was basically just don't slip up, and we'll be fine. And they did that. They avoided slipping up by basically not really committing anything. So now they've got this massive majority, but they're in need of a mission for it. And it sounds like they've landed on what would be a great mission, which is boosting economic growth, potentially through supply side reform. They've tried to do a little bit of investment, quite a lot of investment and borrowing at the budget, but they've really moved. I mean, Kristian points out that they were sort of started being a bit YIMBY maybe a year and a half ago, but since their speech in December, their reset speech was all about growth, and that's where they are now. And they keep talking about it, and there's more and more op-eds and more, we're not going to let the blockers stop things on X and all of that sort of thing, which is good news. But by all accounts, and in that Economist piece at Davos, the reaction so far been a bit of a shrug to the, well, we'll believe it when we see it. And I think that's maybe our reaction too.
It takes more than words to turn an unfortunate situation around. And I think it is important to recognise there is no, I think, inherent contradiction in being a very pro-growth, supply-side liberalising social democratic party. Now, we're not going to expect Labour to suddenly engage in a wave of mass privatisations, shall we say, or to really go after public sector workers. They are always going to want to be a party that, relative to the other option, taxes more and spends more and does more redistribution. And I mean, that's just kind of inherent in the DNA of that political movement. But I think you can look at stuff coming out of, say, the Tony Blair Institute, or indeed the whole kind of Blairite ethos, even when he was in government, which was we want a booming economy so that we can redistribute more and improve public services. So it's not like they have to completely abandon everything that they're about. There has been this kind of movement in America, supply-side progressives, people who want abundance and they want pro-growth policies to get there, but they don't want it just for the sake of growth and dynamism and creative destruction. They want it actually for social purposes as well as economic ones. And that's fine, and maybe Labour could fall into that camp. But I think that there are things holding them back. I mean, first of all, these ideas, as you suggest, Kristian, they're not very deeply embedded, and they're not yet particularly well thought out, I think, on the left in British politics. I don't think they're very well thought out or embedded on the right of British politics either, for that matter, but that's a separate question. So in terms of the ideas, I think they've got a long way to go. And if they think that what they're bringing forward now on capital markets, on regulation, on housing, is the super radical stuff that's really going to move the needle, I think they might be in for a rude awakening. I think they will realise that they would have to go much further to have a significant impact. But then I think you look at the interests side of this, and not to be too cynical about it, but they are a political party largely funded by trade unions who basically prioritise the rights and the salaries of public sector workers. And of course, that does include an awful lot of bureaucrats. Our colleague Steve Davies has described this as sort of the last stand of the old bureaucracy and the last roll of the dice to see if we can do things the way we've been trying to do them for the last 15 years. And we can talk about the government trying to fight back against lawfare and so on. But Keir Starmer is almost the epitome of the legalistic bureaucrat. And I don't say that to be personally insulting, but that just seems to be his entire ethos. And until recently, that was sort of sold as a strength. He was someone who played by the rules and managed things competently and could work the bureaucracy and get government to do what he wanted in a way that Conservatives completely failed to do. So I just think on those two crucial factors, ideas and interests, they've got a long way to go before they make a big dent here. But we'll see.
But then again, on the point of supply-side progressivism, so one of the things that helped Roger Douglas in the early days was that even though he did upset interest groups, especially I think the farming lobby was one of the main ones, those were groups that traditionally voted for the other party anyway. So he upset interest groups that he could afford to upset. And we could have a similar situation here where a lot of the resistance, obviously not public sector, but say NIMBY groups trying to block projects, where these are groups that are mostly either conservative leaning or liberal Democrats, and where a Labour government could just afford politically to say, well, okay, these are people who are in the enemy camp from their lost cause from our perspective anyway. So if we have to upset someone, this is a political battle that is eminently winnable.
And one of the interesting things about the government's overall agenda and approach is how different it has been in different fields. And there are certain fields where those interest groups have been particularly strong. Think about the Employment Rights Bill and arguably the Schools Bill as well, where unions have clearly basically written those bits of legislation. And maybe it's a tactic to give the unions and their sort of traditional base what they want through those methods, and then buy themselves a little bit of room to be a bit more growth. Now, maybe being extremely sympathetic, but I just think it's one of the interesting things about the government at the moment is different places, they're approaching things in very different ways. Which brings us on to our next topic, which is environment and net zero, where the government is certainly taking an opposite approach to, say, our friends across the pond have started to do this week. Trump has signed a number of executive orders which would say rub up against the classic environmental goals. He's withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. He's deregulating oil and gas extraction. He's drill, baby, drill is his line. Which poses an interesting question for us in the UK, of the government here. Is ditching net zero an inevitability, or will the government, or should the government indeed stick with it and go harder precisely because America's going in the other direction?
I think it's very hard to see the current government ditching or even significantly watering down net zero, just because of some of the personalities involved in government and their commitment to this cause, because of a lot of the left-leaning interest groups that surround the government and will push this agenda. Partly, again, because of this kind of legalism and rule-following approach. Not that there's anything wrong with following rules, I would stress that, but the whole way net zero has been set up is to basically force the government to stick to the policy, and if they don't, then they can be sued by all of these interest groups, and the whole thing can get bogged down in judicial review and everything else. So now, none of that is to say that it's impossible to change course, but it's not something that you can do, I think, sort of quietly and without people noticing. There are no sort of sneaky tweaks. It almost has to be a complete deconstruction of the policies that the Conservatives extraordinarily stupidly put in place to give Theresa May a legacy and get her out of Downing Street as soon as possible. And that's kind of where it is. I can't see them breaking out of this. But now, is the climate of opinion shifting in quite a significant way on net zero? I mean, I really think that it is. And this isn't just a fringe thing on the right. And it's not confined, or even the main preserve of people who are skeptical about climate change. I think there's a lot of people who accept that climate change is a problem and that there should be some government action to deal with it, who nevertheless are realizing that the cost of the approach we're taking via net zero is just too much to bear. And actually, there was I thought, a very good article in the Times today by Emma Duncan talking about net zero and kind of riffing off the changes that seem to be happening in America and saying, how is it sustainable for us to keep with this policy when we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the world, the fifth highest, I think she says, domestic or consumer energy prices in the world. And you can have politicians say, as they frequently do, renewables are really cheap. As soon as we're all renewable, energy prices are going to fall. And it's basically a flat out lie, because even if the unit cost, once you've erected your windmills and plugged them into the grid and everything, the marginal cost of an extra unit of electricity might be low. But the capital costs are extremely high, partly because it's so the infrastructure is so widespread. You have to have so many grid connections. Also because it's an intermittent energy source, you have to have a shadow power system operating in the background.
So you basically have two energy grids, effectively.
Which you can ramp up and down according to whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. So it's expensive, first of all, to have two energy systems at once. It's expensive to have one running way below capacity and then suddenly, as happened this week, have to ramp it up suddenly because we had very cold weather, very little wind. Very windy today, but this was a problem earlier in the week. Maybe it's too windy today for wind turbines. I don't know about that. But yeah, Emma Duncan in her article points to a massive spike in the prices that were being paid to gas-fired power generators this week to basically cover the problem that we were having with renewables not generating anything. It's easy to look at this and think, well, okay, we're going to have expensive energy, but also the manufacturing businesses are all gone or going anyway. The future is services, the future is tech. She makes this point in the Times, but then notes the US Department of Energy forecast that in 3 years' time, around 10%, I think they say 7 to 12 or something, but around 10% of America's electricity is going to be used for AI.
Yeah.
Right? So we are not living in a world where demand for electricity is going to fall. And if we're keeping electricity very expensive, and also, by the way, I guess in a way this is the big thing, if America is ditching this whole agenda, if China and India were never really signed up to it anyway, this basically becomes a European preoccupation, and a bunch of countries that don't contribute all that much to global emissions anyway, repeatedly stabbing themselves economically for the sake of a Pyrrhic victory. That's a drop in the ocean globally.
Yeah, I mean,
So just quickly, the argument against the Britain counts for less than 1% of all global emissions, so why should we go for this, was always to play a global leadership role. There's an argument now the government should just put a hand up and go, right, well, that's not gone too well, at least not right now, as other countries completely ignore. So why do we, as you say, keep stabbing ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, so the main argument against net zero has always been that, of course, as you said, Britain contributes less than 1% to global CO2 emissions. It's just that environmentalist groups, like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and the older ones, Greenpeace, they really, really hate that argument. Their counter argument has always been, well, but if everybody thought that way, nothing would ever happen. The problem with that, though, is that it's not either or. It's not let's decarbonize unilaterally, irrespective of what the rest of the world does, and let's do absolutely nothing on the decarbonization front. This is a broad spectrum. There's many things in between, and you could just settle at a different point in that spectrum, right? And if you have, so I guess for a while, this argument may have that if Britain starts, the rest of the world will follow global leadership, moral leadership. Maybe that seemed plausible for a while, but if it just becomes clearer and clearer that many other large economies are just, are increasing their carbon emissions rather than reducing them. And if Britain's share falls from, I think it's now 0.9% or so of global emissions, if it falls to even lower levels at some point, it starts to look increasingly silly that you have what is effectively a very minor contributor impoverishing itself, not making much of a difference to global emissions, and just doing this for the sake of it. And then it just becomes harder to sustain that agenda. That doesn't mean that we'll go to drill, baby, drill, and ditch everything. There will always be, so say the carbon trading system that we have, the carbon cap and trade system. I don't see why that would disappear, that there's always going to be a carbon policy of some sort, but that's different from net zero. That's different from saying by a specific date, it has to have this specific target level. And that could just make it harder to justify the costs if it becomes clearer and clearer that the rest of the world isn't following, that this global leadership idea was never that plausible to begin with. And I never bought it in the first place, because the only way in which you could show global leadership, and I don't like that term anyway, but if you buy into that whole agenda, the only way in which you could make other economies follow you is if you decarbonized and you could show that you're doing it at a really, really low cost. So that others say, oh, okay, the Brits have done this, and they're still rich, so essentially this isn't a big problem. Why don't we do the same? But if we go for an agenda where we impose a massive economic cost upon ourselves, then of course other economies are going to say, okay, well, the Brits have decarbonized and now they're a third world country, they've impoverished themselves, let's not do what they've done. Yeah,
exactly.
Then you have the exact opposite of global leadership.
And we're putting ourselves at a comparative disadvantage in terms of investment while the US drill baby drill gets cheaper energy. We know how important energy is for growth on the whole, to be an attractive place to invest, and people will take one look at the UK compared to America, like they do in many other ways, and probably say, well, why would I bother coming to?
Yeah, and it is important to say, like, now, will you get to net zero without heavy-handed government involvement by 2050? I don't know. I guess probably not. not to prejudge the path of technological development or anything, but that does perhaps seem like a slightly tall order. But could you achieve quite dramatic decarbonisation over the next few decades simply through technology advancing, things becoming more efficient, maybe through a really sensible, radical approach to nuclear, where you regulate far more proportionately and deal with a lot of the costs that are involved with nuclear, which are largely regulatory rather than costs that are inherent to that type of technology. I mean, there are ways of producing a lot of energy cleanly or without carbon emissions. Likewise, I mean, I don't think you need to say that all internal combustion engine cars will be banned or they won't be able to sell new ones from a certain date. We were already seeing electric cars becoming more popular. You already see hybrid technology developing really well. And in a way, as soon as you have this big top-down government plan, and in a way, it's not just one plan, it's a series of shorter plans and legal requirements that you have to hit along the way. And there are problems inherent in that in itself. Actually, I think the way that net zero is sort of structured can sometimes run counter to the long-term goal of decarbonisation, because there may be things where actually you might need more carbon emissions in the short term, but the outcome might actually be less carbon emissions in the long run. So an example of that could be if you had mass housing redevelopment. A lot of environmentalists would say all of this demolition is horrendous because you're releasing lots of embodied carbon into the atmosphere. You can't do that because over the timescale of our current carbon budget, you'd be violating your legal responsibilities. We're going to take you to court, force you to change course, etc., etc. Now, on the other hand, if you rebuilt lots of Britain to modern standards, and I'm not necessarily, I want that. Like I live in Victorian housing for a reason. Part of it, I like drafty buildings.
And dumb.
And well, the damp I'm less keen on, frankly. But anyway, like there would be huge long-run savings from that. That's the only way that you're probably going to make like heat pumps everywhere a realistic option for the UK housing and building stock. So in some ways, the way we do net zero can be counterproductive to its long-term aims as well. But I also think there's that broader point there that you can think, well, I may not want net zero specifically or not by this particular date. I still think decarbonisation is an important environmental goal, but are there ways to achieve it that go with the grain of technological development, with markets, and which would actually involve supply-side liberalisation, making it easier to build things, to develop things, everything else. And so you can support a growth objective at the same time rather than undermining it. But we are very much in the undermining camp at the moment. It is clear to me that the public mood has shifted quite dramatically. I suppose it's taken people a while to realise just how bad things are economically in Britain, but I think they're waking up to it post-COVID, post the inflation, and when the cost of living pressures have really started to bite. Suddenly it's quite meaningful to kind of average earners to tell them, do you feel richer than you did 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Frankly, probably not. Even if you are fractionally so in real terms, well, your housing, your fixed costs, your housing, your utilities and stuff are likely much more expensive than they used to be. So, and you have less to spend on the things you want rather than the things you need. Net zero, it seems to me, was a policy that was sustainable in terms of public support when we still laboured under the delusion that a return to growth was just around the corner, that Britain was still one of the leading economies in the world. Maybe British exceptionalism comes into this argument in more than one way. One is the idea of showing global leadership. The other one is the sense that actually, we're still a great economic power. I hate to say it, that we're not really. At least we're going in the wrong direction. So the public mood has shifted. I suspect the political mood will follow, whether it comes from this government or a subsequent one. I mean, remains to be seen. But my guess is what you've seen in America this week is just the start of a backlash in developed world governments around the world.
And it was also sold to the public as essentially cost-free net
Yes.
zero. You had environmentalist campaigners, some saying, well, this will only affect a few oil billionaires, so don't worry, this has nothing to do with you. And some were even saying, this is the way to build up a prosperous green economy, and we're going to subsidize our way into prosperity. We're going to make ourselves rich by building up this green economy without making clear that, yes, of course, you can build up a sector that you call the green economy, but that's going to be financed with resources that you pull out of the productive economy, and you're not making yourself richer in overall terms. That was never going to happen, but it was rhetorically sold in this way, and in the wave of this enthusiasm created by all these new environmentalist groups and around Greta Thunberg, becoming a saint-like figure for a couple of years, and then Extinction Rebellion just springing up around that. And it was all announced in that context, and nobody thought about actual costs.
I mean, the irony, of course, is that a lot of green industry is quite energy intensive to build this stuff in the first place. So if you have extremely high energy costs, you're probably not even going to benefit from a lot of green manufacturing and so on. You're not going to have electric car plants or whatever. You're not going to have anything like that. So building solar cells, whatever. We need a rethink.
And there's also, the more parochial lifestyle changes that you're asking people to make. As soon as you introduce things like ULEZ, for example, in London, or it's tell people they can't drive certain types of car, they start to think, hang on a second, why not? And then when you pair that with the general decline, or at least not rise in living standards in however many years, they start to think, well, why are we worrying about what fuel I put in my car when I can't afford to buy a house, etc., etc., and that sort of self-perpetuates. On this topic, or on sort of links to this topic at the moment this week, there's been a big sort of, we're once again discussing more runways at Gatwick, Heathrow, and elsewhere. Luton was the third one, thank you. And so that's been floated in sort of leaked briefings or whatever you like to call it, and immediately the sort of the debate is raging again about whether that's the right call. And I think lots of people would say that is the right call for growth, but it also has environmental downsides. But there's more to improving our aviation and improving competition and growth in that field than just runways. Kristian?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I occasionally go back to obsessing about this issue, the airport industry, the aviation industry, is that I think what's happened there is just a microcosm of everything that's going wrong with the British economy. So you had the backstory to this is that air travel was liberalized in the mid-80s, and that was the start of a massive boom where you had lots of new entrants into the industry, consumer prices falling, consumer choice increasing, productivity going up, and a massive increase in air passengers. So a fantastic free market success story in a way, because air travel used to be within living memory almost a luxury good, and it's then become a mass market product. It became a booming sector, and this is all great. And this is one sector where liberalization, free market reforms have clearly worked. The sort of thing we should be shouting about from the rooftops. All well and good so far. It's just at some point then hit a capacity constraint where you're trying to squeeze more and more flights, more and more passengers into a very limited physical infrastructure, which is basically the infrastructure that we've inherited from the 1950s. So we're trying to squeeze the entire modern economy into the physical infrastructure of a bygone era of the post-war period. And what happened then was that these problems of limited capacity and that this is going to become the bottleneck for growth, that was already pointed out in the 1990s. You can find articles on this from the 90s saying things are fine for now, but if growth rates in the aviation sector and the air travel industry continue at anything like the current rate, then in a couple of years we're going to just completely run out of runway space. The airports are going to be too congested, and there will be all the growth potential that we have is going to be exhausted, and it's going to go elsewhere. So it's been known for a long time. And in that way, it's a bit like No Room, No Room, the book that we've republished, where you can find economists pointing this out ages ago and nothing happening. And this is one of those cases where this analysis from the 90s, we're about to hit a capacity constraint, was then repeated, confirmed in it must have been a government expert review or something in the Blair years. And a third runway at Heathrow was actually approved in the Gordon Brown years, I think it was. It was then immediately cancelled in the early coalition Cameron years in order to appease the NIMBYs and MPs representing seats in the vicinity of Heathrow. And yeah, it was a short-term popularity boost. But then, of course, by then, that problem that was being warned about in the 90s had really hit. You could really see in the numbers that Heathrow constantly congested, always close to capacity. And you notice that when you take a flight from Heathrow, when you have a flight that is initially just slightly delayed, that can very easily turn into a massive delay because they lose the takeoff slot. And then they need to get a new one, and there aren't any new ones available. So it just makes it massively unpleasant and disruptive. It's just that when you're on the plane and you don't follow the economics of the sector, you're not going to blame NIMBYs or political decisions on runway infrastructure. You will just think, well, it's the airline's fault. They're just incompetent, or it's the airport's fault, or whoever. And therefore, the cost of this, well, we feel it, but we don't attribute it to the actual culprits. And what happened is this is a topic which comes up every couple of years, where you have a government saying, "Oh, this will be an easy way to get some growth into the economy. Why don't we finally go ahead and build the third runway and build a runway at Gatwick?" And then it gets then it just gets tangled up in lawfare. There's that issue again, and it somehow goes dormant, and until a new government discovers it anew and announces it, and with a big fanfare, and then nothing happens again. So I remember I wrote a paper on this, I think 2013, so 12 years ago. At the time of writing, I hadn't yet fully figured out how bad things were in NIMBY Britain, how this NIMBYocracy, vetocracy really works. I remember thinking at the time of writing, oh, I hope they don't sort out the problem while the paper is still in the process, because imagine it comes out and they've already solved it, and then my paper is totally irrelevant, and then what do I do then? And here we are, 12 years later. I mean, if we republished it today, I think I'd barely change anything, maybe 2 figures here and there.
Yeah. I mean, there's an irony here. I remember the Conservatives' 2010 general election manifesto saying they were going to scrap plans to build a third runway at Heathrow and instead build a high-speed rail network around the country. And I mean, here we are 15 years on, how many tens of billions have been spent? There's still no high-speed railway. There's still no third runway at Heathrow. I mean, this idea of people predicting capacity constraints long in advance and identifying these supply-side rigidities, which stop development from happening, and lo and behold, we find ourselves in the problem and it gets worse and worse. I mean, you see them all over the place, and not to hark back immediately to our previous topic, but there were plenty of people in the early and mid-2000s talking about the energy problem Britain had, that we hadn't been building enough energy infrastructure, and that we were going to have capacity issues in some time. And you got that same sort of political short-sightedness, when Nick Clegg was nixing the idea of any new nuclear, saying, well, what's the point in new nuclear? It wouldn't come online for 10 years. Well, 10 years would have put it right about when Russia invaded Ukraine and global gas prices shot through the roof. So maybe it's one of those things where the best time is 10 years ago, the second best time is today on all of these fronts.
Exactly the same. Prisons, just to throw another example in there, people have been saying for years, they're saying, look, this is the population, and this is the capacity, and at one point they're going to cross, and we're going to run out of places, and lo and behold, that was 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And so maybe, I mean, this is jumping slightly off on a tangent, but when we look at those long-term fiscal projections of what's going to happen to public spending with an aging population on current policy commitments, and you just see spending skyrocketing, to the effect that you'd effectively have to double income tax, everyone's income tax payment over the next 50 years to afford to pay for people's pensions and old age healthcare and social care and stuff. And I think everybody says, yes, we can see that problem. The trajectory is clear. That is such an unimaginably bad outcome that something will change before we get there. Right, we don't need to worry about that. At some point, the circumstance will become so severe. and you can say the same thing for energy. Lots of people for a few years now have been predicting blackouts, maybe quite severe blackouts, and the possibility. But if you've got a nationwide blackout, it'll be quite hard to get the energy system up and running again. I don't understand the science of all of this, but apparently it's not as simple as just switching it off and switching it on. If an electricity grid just goes completely down and has to be restored, people don't know what that would look like. And you think, well, of course, we'll change course before we get there, but will we?
It's because the people saying we'll change course before we get there are relying on people in their position making a different decision to theirs
Decision at some other
for
point.
some other reason.
I do want to talk about this auction idea for airport landing slots as well, because I think it was the Badgett column in The Economist this week was talking about, the fact that Heathrow, I think 99% of landing slots at Heathrow are grandfathered to the airlines. And so whenever a new slot comes up, there's enormous competition and people pay way over the odds for that price. But basically it means that British Airways dominates the main airport and it severely restricts the amount of competition that you can get. And the argument from economists has always been, why are you just letting these airlines keep their landing slots indefinitely as long as they keep using them, kind of irrespective of how efficiently they're using them or how they're pricing them? Why not regularly have auctions to allocate that scarce resource? Granted that it should be less scarce because we should actually build the additional runways, but it'll still be a scarce resource and that you'll still want to allocate it as efficiently as possible. The most efficient means of allocation is through the price system. So let's auction those landing slots. We shouldn't be in a situation where one airline completely dominates the national airport, unless that's just the natural market outcome, which it could be if you auction those slots off. I don't know. But certainly they shouldn't be grandfathered and they shouldn't be set in stone for a long time. And this is one of those things where, I'm about to say, I don't know why it hasn't happened, why it hasn't changed. Now, part of the reason was I think we were tied into a European system, but we're not anymore. And this is maybe one of those easy Brexit wins, which is there for the taking. And, it's probably not just airlines, probably intercity train travel. I know that the denationalisation of the railways has a mixed reputation, and actually there have been mixed results, bad in some places, good in others. Where private railways seem to have really worked is on intercity routes where you have competition, where you have open access providers, where it's not simply one company with one franchise over one route, but you can have competing providers buying slots on the timetable, and maybe they offer a cheaper experience, maybe they offer a higher level of customer service, whatever. Where there has been that competition on the railways, privatisation has worked a lot better. So it seems to me that it works for airports, it would work for rail, and maybe this whole idea of just allocating scarce resources by prices should be more widely applied. It's not exactly a controversial statement at the Institute of Economic Affairs, is it? But there you go.
It's not, but it would be controversial with the airlines, right?
Oh,
who get. So there's the special interest group that you've got to take on, but you could potentially do it in one fell swoop where you say, look, we'll give you a third runway, but the landing slots may be just on that runway, or maybe for all of them, as a sort of way of getting it through. They're all going to be auctioned off. We're all going to grandfather those, and then maybe that's sort of.
Yeah, and you can
sandwich for them.
You can finance the additional runway capacity in that way by auctioning off the slots in advance, and with that revenue, you use that to build the runway. So going back to I said earlier, air travel liberalization from the mid '80s onwards, fantastic free market success story. I guess I have to qualify that statement somewhat. There were always some sub-sectors that were not liberalized, and the airport slots, that is the clearest example of that. That is, you could say, while you had this overall liberalizing trend, there were a few islands of socialism left in that, and the slot allocation system is clearly one of them, where you just had a system where airlines that use a takeoff landing slot at a particular time have an automatic right to keep using it. And that is, I guess you could say they have a no-fault eviction system already. So you cannot evict an airline from a runway as long as it's using the runway. And I think nobody designed the system intentionally in that way. It's just that for a long time, as long as runway capacity wasn't that big a deal, we wouldn't have thought of a takeoff slot, a landing slot, as an economic asset. That would just be an arrangement between, so there's the airport operator, that they have a runway here, they have a lot of infrastructure around it, and that there's an airline that wants to land, and they just come to an arrangement. They ask, are you free at 3 o'clock? Can I land my plane there? And they'll check the timetable and say, yeah, that's free, go ahead. There will be so and so many pounds. Whereas once you have congested runways, that actually becomes a valuable economic asset. So it's a bit like, say, when we book this studio, the podcast room, we don't think of this as an economic asset. We don't think, oh, we are now the owners of a podcast slot, and maybe we can trade it with somebody else who also wants to use the podcast. But if we opened up the studio to people from the outside world and you can book it, and at some point maybe it would become something like that, and you could then say, well, we've got it booked, we've got a permit to use it, but we can sell it to you, and you have to pay for it, or it will be a luxury problem for us.
I have literally thought about on the occasions where we have oversubscribed events here at the IEA. I've thought, well, we put people on waiting lists and we tell them, I'm sorry, can't let you in this time. And I think, this is classic sort of tragedy of the commons thinking. We haven't priced something and there is overconsumption, and so people are leaving unsatisfied. I did wonder, maybe we should just have some sort of auction system for seats at our events if they're oversubscribed. When you RSVP, you have to put the maximum price you'd be prepared to pay for the ticket, and then you do some kind of crafty automatic auction afterwards to make sure that attending IEA events is allocated to the people who value coming to the IEA the most. Now, I don't think we're going to actually do that. That seems like a bit of an administrative headache to put on our operations team. So no, don't worry. But yeah, this is a generalizable point. Roads. Right? Roads are congested. That's a scarce resource. It's an economic asset. I don't think you're going to auction off driving slots, but a dynamic system of road pricing, which adjusts the price to travel on a particular stretch of road according to the time of day, according to day of the week, according to the demand, basically, for that road space. That, again, could be a very powerful economic thing. And so we started this podcast talking about will Labour go down this route of supply-side liberalisation? I think we've then spent the other half of the podcast talking about all kinds of supply-side liberalisations, which would be very welcome. And actually, I don't see any particular reason why a Labour government shouldn't pursue them. But of course, it's more difficult than that once you add politics into the mix.
Politics does tend to ruin things.
Perhaps not so much in this case, because for airport slots, the resistance would really just come from British Airways. They are the main beneficiaries. And that's the main issue with that system, that you have the old incumbents still holding on to slots that they've inherited and that have become super valuable in the meantime. They probably weren't worth much when they were given them, but they have in the meantime, and it's the big incumbents benefiting from this. They would probably hate it if they. So what this means is that right now they're getting an extremely valuable economic asset for free, just allocated by a regulator, and under an auction or some other kind of market system, they'd have to pay for it, and it would cost a lot of money.
Well, we will see where we end up with that. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today on the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast, but thank you for joining us. If you want to hear more from us, go to our Substack, which is insider.iea.org.uk. And if you want to come to any of our events in the near future, well, seats are available to the highest bidder.